You've probably seen a lot of videos in Blender of using painted normal maps to affect the shading to get a painterly shaded look. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through how to do that in Maya. And along the way, I'm gonna go over how to add artistic brushstrokes to normal maps in Substance Painter, as well as how to add those artistic brushstrokes to normal maps in Rebelle. What's really special about this is you're not just putting texture maps of a painting onto the color, you're altering the normals, which changes the way that the shader shades. So these normal maps will affect how the light interacts with the material and shades it across the surface, which is pretty awesome. So yeah, let's just dive right into it. So the first thing we need to do is export out the world space normals as texture maps. And before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about some housekeeping issues with UVs. So on this chair, for example, if we go into the UV editor, you'll see that we have different materials on these different parts. Like this wood part has one material and the leather part has a different material, but they're sharing the same UVs. So if I just kind of go into here and pick all of these parts here, all of these parts together share this one UV region. And we could write them out individually and have a whole bunch of maps that just have parts of it, but that's kind of inefficient. So what we want to do is combine these. There's a couple ways you could do this. You could export them all out individually and then go into Nuke and then use a plus and combine them all back together and write it out again. Just to stay inside of Maya, I'm just going to go into here and say mesh combine. And this would be a thing that you would do temporarily. There's logical reasons why you'd want to keep them separate so you can assign different materials to them. So this is really just for the sake of exporting them out to bring them into Substance Painter to do the texture maps and to have the texture maps combined into one island. So we got that taken care of. The other thing that we need to care about is that when you're exporting these out, what you need to do, like say if I'm going to export out the floor, you need to hide all the other things. The reason you need to do that is because otherwise you're going to get wherever there's something intersecting or touching this mesh, for example, everything on the floor is touching it, it's going to render out black in those areas. And that would mean that you just don't have that normals information there. And so, if you, for example, wanted to in layout move this chair a little bit, you kind of would have your hands tied there. So what you want to do is hide all the other things besides what you're exporting out at the moment. So let's start off by exporting out the chair. And as I was saying, I'm gonna hide all the other things while I do this, and then I'm going to come into here and in the node editor, we've got an AI flat shader. Let me assign it to this, and I'm going to launch a render here. So here we have the world space normal showing for the chair. And the way that I did that is I have an AI flat, I have an add, which at the moment is doing nothing. I'm going to come back and explain why I'm doing that in a second. And I have a state vector. State vector is set to n. So this is giving me the world space normals. That's what that means. And you'll see though that on these areas here, it's pretty much completely black, and that's going to make it really hard to see what you're doing as you're painting for those parts. And so because of that, what we want to do is come into the plus and just lift it up a little bit, add 0.5. And then that brings it up into a space where we can see everything, so we can paint. And what we're going to do later on is we're going to reverse that when we come back in and apply it in the shader. So let me stop the render from going, and we're just going to export this out. So I go into here, into utilities, and I say render selection to texture. I need to give the resolution that I want to write this out at. So I'm going to write it out at 2K. If you have UDIMs, you'd want to check this here. I don't in this particular case. And of course, you need to give the output folder where you're writing to. And then you click render. Okie dokie, I'm in Substance Painter, and I've got my normal maps loaded in here, and I'm gonna get to work on this chair. So first thing I want to do is make a fill layer, and I'm going to just have on only the color, so that's Alt click, and now it only has the color there. And then I take my map for the normals and drag it over into here, and it applies onto there. And then I want to paint on top of it. So I'm going to take this layer and drag it to the top. And what I want to do is set this to pass through. And then I'm going to come over into the smudge tool. And whatever I smudge in here, let me put this on to just all by itself, isolated mode. Whatever I paint on here with the smudge tool, it's going to take the colors underneath it and smudge them, as I hope you can see here. There we go, a little more obvious. And so yeah, but we're going to smudge those in a nicer way using a painterly brush. So let me undo those changes. But I should also mention, it's worth mentioning, that if I smudge this like this and then go into the erase tool, I can just erase it away and then come back and paint that area. So it's a very flexible workflow. I want to switch the display to viewing in RAW, and I want to switch this to base color, so we're just seeing our texture information and we can see a lot more clearly what we're doing as we work. And then in the smudge tool, I'm going to come over here to turn off this filter and come into the brushes, and I'm going to filter for Paintbox. That is a whole bunch of the Kyle's paintbrushes are called Kyle's Paintbox, and then there's just a bunch of stuff in here, so it just filters out kind of the nice painterly brushes. And let's see, there's a bunch that are really nice. You just kind of play around with them and see what you like. I'm going to start off with fence paint. And you can kind of see here that on some areas where we have the more pure color, like right where I'm painting right here, it's pretty hard to see anything. So what you can do there is you make a filter for the fill layer. I'm going to set it to only affect the color, and I'm going to filter for color and find color correct, and then I'll expand out the shadows, midtones, and highlights, and I'm just going to knock down the saturation on these. So yeah, maybe that'll work. You basically have to play with it, and what you'd want to do is once you're done, you would disable this for the export. So let me go back to my paint layer and continue painting onto this. This is really blown out over here. So let me adjust this. What's causing that? I could also view it through log, maybe? No. Yeah, I'll just turn it off to paint this part here. If you're wondering what that window is that pops up every so often, that's just because I have fat fingers and I'm accidentally hitting some key on my Wacom tablet that I don't want to be hitting. Let me turn this back on so I can see this part a little better. You can see it down here, it has this update thing, so it's thinking about it. It takes it a little bit of time to calculate out the color corrections. I can't really see anything here, so I'm going to try to adjust this. So this is the voice of future me. The reason I can't smudge across this area is because this area is flat and therefore it is just solid one color, because there isn't a variation in the orientation of the geometry. So we're going to come back to how to deal with flat areas of geometry later on in this video. And you can of course play around with different brushes and whatnot, and as you can see here, I'm gonna blend them a little bit to get more of kind of a subtle painted look on here. It's going to be a little bit of a back and forth process because you got to sort of see what the effect is of your brushes in the render. But yeah, that's the basic workflow, and then we would export this out. So to do that, come into export textures, and going to export out just my chair here. And I've made myself a template here, writing out the base color to RGB, and I have a thing on here for UDIMs if I need that, and the texture set name. But the really important thing is I'm writing it out as EXR, and that is crucial because you want to write it out in raw. You don't, so it's a little bit of a combo problem here. I need to write out to base color because otherwise a smudge brush with pass-through doesn't work on the other channels. It seems to only work on base color. So I'm writing out to base color, but I don't want it to do a color conversion for the base color. I don't want it to do a sRGB transform to it. So I'm writing it out to EXR, which I have set out to always write out as raw, and that's how I get around that, because this is a non-color map. It's a data map, which should be in raw. So yeah, so you export out those texture maps, and then we're ready to jump into Maya. So I wanted to show you what I did on this and how I got this area looking nicer. So I have just this set to not changing anything with the contrast and luminosity and just lowering the saturation down. And the issue of why I was just seeing green here and wasn't seeing brush strokes is because this area is just flat and it just is completely green. There isn't any colors to see in there. And so to just show you kind of what I did, let me do that on this side part. So what I did is I took the edges and I just big brushstroke painted into there. So I'm kind of taking the purple here that's underneath there and just kind of dragging that down into there, and maybe I'll take some orange coming around the side here and drag that around, and some blue over here, and then I got these colors in here and I can just kind of play around with them and whack them around. Let me, since I'm over here, make this look a little nicer in here. Yeah, and then once you're happy with everything, then you can export that out. And again, you want to turn this off before exporting. Okay, so we are here in Maya. So let me walk you through the shader setup and the AOVs. The AOVs I have here are all kind of custom LPEs. And what I'm doing is, well, first of all, let me talk about the shader for a second. So I have here this part here is a toon shader here, and I'm using that to get toon outlines, which I have here in the edge. It's a little bit hard to see, so let me bump up the exposure on that for you so you can see them. There we go. And I have those set up to be bright in the lights and darker there, and darker in the shadows. And the way that I'm doing that with the toon shader is that I have the color going into, and for sake of demonstration, the color is just a flat color, just so you're not getting distracted by that, but that normally would be the texture map. And that is going into the edge color and the base color. And the edge color also has a tone map going into it that is a ramp here, and that is how I'm getting it to lighten and darken in the shadows and lights of the edge. And the way that you make a edge AOV is you just go make a custom LPE, or a custom AOV rather. So just come in here and say add custom and just name it edge, and Arnold will know what to do with that and will give you this. And I should also mention that I have contour on for the filter for in the render settings, and over on the AOVs I have the edge is set to contour and everything else is set to Gaussian. The other thing that's coming from the toon shader is the emission, and for whatever reason this is what it outputs for the emission for, now this is overly bright, so let me put this back down to regular values, and that's pretty dark, but that's okay. We want this to be subtle, and this is the toon shading. Make it a little bit brighter so you can see it a little better. This is the toon shading that I have, and the toon shading is again using the toon shader and that has the color in the base and a tone map with a ramp going into it to get this sort of cell shaded look. And that tone mapping comes through in the emission. And I should say that the way that I'm combining these together is that you put the toon shader through an AI pass-through and then connect that to a mixed shader. Let me go back to the beauty here and set this back to regular. And I'm mixing it here. If you want to just get the toon outlines and nothing from the toon shader otherwise, and you just want to get everything from this shader, then you would need to put the mix weight on 0.99, and you have to have, if you put it onto 1, the toon lines won't come through anymore, so it has to be as close as you can get to 1 without actually being 1. So there's a little bit of contribution coming from this. And the toon shader itself has to have something coming into the base. So you can just leave it at the default values if you don't want everything from the base, or you can set it to be like almost entirely black, but it can't be 0 coming through there. Okay, so that's a little side topic on combining together edge shading with a standard surface, but let's now take a look at the actual painted normal shader. So I have in here the shader which has the base, the specular, and in this case, the coat. I'm using the coat as a specular. I'm using the specular as a diffuse, and I'm using the base as like kind of a flat bottom coating. So let me show you what those look like. So this is what's coming in from the base, and I have the diffuse roughness set all the way up, so that gives it Orinaire shading, which is sort of like a flat shading. And you can already see that the normal maps are being affected by our painted normals, or you could see that the shading is affected by our painted normals here on the edges, which is pretty nice. Then next up we have the contribution to from the specular. That's what this looks like. And here I have the color map going into the specular. I have the specular cranked up to 20, so it's not doing a typical dielectric specular. It's more like a metal kind of thing of a color specular. And I have the roughness up pretty high because I want to get sort of a broad shading across here. And this looks pretty nice and sweet. And then we have the shine. That's what's coming from the coat. And I just have here, just some settings to put a little bit of shine into that. So what we have going into here is the color map. And as I said, that's going into the specular color and the base color. And then we have our normal information. And what we're doing here is we're not reading in a normal map. We're changing the world space normals. So let me show you that kind of going from left to right. So we have here, if I click on this and select this, show it to me. This is my texture map that I wrote out of Substance Painter. And the first thing we need to do to it is convert it back. We had added a plus 0.5, and we now need to subtract 0.5 to bring it back into the normal range of world space normals. And then I have a AI space transform, which I will come back to in just a second and talk about. Before I do that, let me just kind of keep on going through here. Here, this is a AI state vector set to n for normal. That is going to give us the ability to blend between regular normals and our painted normals. And so here the blender is all the way on 1, and if I slide it over this way, then it shows the state vector normals. Then that goes into a normal map, and it goes into the normal slot on a normal map. You could, if you didn't want to have this guy in here, you could just directly output this straight into the world normals of your standard surface shader. The reason that you might want to do this is because you can then, now it's not going to show anything on here, but you can play with the strength of it, the strength of the effect. So right now it's just on 1, and you could make it higher and get a stronger effect, or lower and get a more subtle effect. And what's kind of crucial here is that I have here a AI image node, and I have ignore missing textures turned on, and I have in here that classic bluish normal map color. That is the values of RGB 0.5, 0.5, and 1. And that is going into the input for, and it's essentially a tangent normal map that doesn't do anything, but Arnold needs it in there, otherwise it's going to get confused and break the whole shader. So let me show you the reason that we need to have the AI space transform. So here's this chair, and let's say that I wanted to rotate it and position it differently in the room. So I want to turn it like that. The problem is that the normals are sticking to this. They're staying on it like a texture map. And if I come over to here and take the blender and switch it over to what the world normals would be in this particular position, you can see that it's completely different. Let me, just for sake of showing you, put it back to its original position and then show you that. Here they match. So what we needed to do is we needed to, when it's been rotated or moved in the scene, well, really mostly rotated, then it needs to recalculate for that new world space position. So we need to, what we need to do is we need to come into here to the space transform. We need to set this to normal and turn on normalize and come into here and make it from object to world. So as I turn this is just the regular calculated world space normals. Notice how this area here, which is black when it's in this position, becomes blue as I bring it over here, and this becomes black. And if I switch it over to show the painted normals, you can observe how the same thing happens. It's black in here, and then it gets pulled around and it becomes blue. What it's doing is it's converting it from the object space normals in the original origin position and recalculating it as it is rotated. It's worth mentioning that this works with rigid body translation, rotation, scale. It does not work with deformations. So this is something that you can, this whole technique is something that will work for any kind of rigid body object, like a prop, like a set element. It does not work for characters because characters deform. And the normal space transform is only applied to the original position and orientation pre-deform. So this method works great when you have a rounded complex object like this chair here, but it's going to be more challenging with an object like this wall or the floor here, where it's essentially just one value because it's just one plane. So let me show you a kind of a strategy for dealing with that. I'm going to jump back into Maya, and so what I'm going to do is create a noise in the displacement and then output these normals as textures, but with that noise perturbing the surface to give us a bunch of different colors to work with. We're not going to be able to use this in Substance Painter because the way that we're working is we're using the smudge tool to smudge the colors across, and it's just going to take the average of all of those smudges, which will be the exact same color that the whole thing is made up of, and that'll give us a result of nothing. We're going to instead take it into Rebelle. Alright, so I'm here in Rebelle and I've read in my image. Important to note that I rendered it out as EXR. Rebelle cannot read EXR, so I had to convert it into a PNG, and keeping that in raw color space. And here I'm making a trace layer. That's what that T does. And therefore anything above it that I paint onto it will trace. And what it does is the first click, it'll grab the pigment from where you clicked and then paint with that stroke from that one pigment. And that's the secret sauce of why this works, whereas it doesn't work in Substance Painter, where it's smearing across a whole bunch of colors and smearing all of them together, and therefore ending up with nothing. Here, this will pick the exact point that I'm clicking on and whatever color I happen to hit and make that for the whole paint stroke. Here, I'm lowering the impasto depth, and probably you want to have it completely off, so you're just getting the brushstroke color and not getting what effectively is shading on here. You can see later on when we bring it into Maya, maybe a little bit could look nice, but you do want to consider turning that off. What's nice is you can turn it off afterwards. You can paint the whole thing like this and then just come in and turn off the impasto depth and it'll all just disappear, so it's a non-destructive workflow. And so yeah, so I'm just here using the trace option to just grab pigments per click and paint it across. Now I'm switching to the blend mode, and now what I'm doing is I have these colors in here, these brush strokes in here, and now I'm blending between the different brush strokes just to kind of break up the pattern, make it a little more complex and painterly. So this is, if you will, this is the smudge tool that you have in Substance Painter once I've laid these down. And something to think about with this whole workflow is that there's advantages and disadvantages to each software program. The disadvantages of painting in Rebelle is that you can't see it in 3D, so it makes it a little more challenging to know what you're doing. The clear advantage is that Rebelle is just way nicer as far as the brush strokes and the quality of the brush strokes, as well as this tracing function, which is really nice. So it could be a useful technique to kind of go back and forth between the two software. You could maybe go into Substance Painter and just paint some brush strokes onto here just so you get an idea of what size they ought to be, and then bring it into Rebelle and just do your actual nice work from that basis. Another workflow would be that you paint something like the chair initially in Substance Painter, and then you bring that painted chair, the painted normals, into here and just take a second pass at it in Rebelle with this technique, with the tracing technique, to get more clear delineation between the brush strokes. Here are those maps applied in Maya, and you can see here a couple things. One is that I think the impasto depth is probably too high still. It was like barely on, and I think I'd prefer to just maybe have it off rather than getting these brush strokes in there. It's a matter of taste, I guess. And the size on the left wall, I think the size is pretty good, but on the right wall it's too big. So that's another thing to consider. So here's the render after some tweaking and adjustments. And what I ended up doing, which I think worked pretty nicely, is for the walls and floor, I took the displacement and I increased it, the depth of it, so I get more color variation, and then took that into Rebelle and just painted over that like I was showing, to get those brush strokes that you're seeing, on the floor and the wall. On the floor, it's combined together with a stylized texture map. And then in addition to that, while I was at it, I also did the same technique in Rebelle, but painting over the already painted chair. The chair that I had painted in Substance Painter, I just sort of did strokes over that to get more of a distinctive, clear brushstroke look to it. And as I was saying, that combination of using both Substance Painter and Rebelle together, kind of going back and forth between them, that works really nice. So, yeah, thanks for watching, and hope it helps you to make your own cartoon stuff.